All right. So we're continuing on. What we're looking at in this video, and there will be a couple of videos for this topic. We're looking at the Constitutional Convention. So this is topic 3.8. In the last video, or the last topic, you learned about the Articles of Confederation and how they, as a form of national government, ended up being too weak, right? So they were failing. By the mid 1780s, and it was becoming clear that a stronger, more structured government was going to be necessary for the United States. So this video, we're going to cover the Constitutional Convention, which occurred from May to September of 1787. In this first video, I just want to talk about who the framers were, who were the men that attended this Constitutional Convention, and what were some of their philosophical views on government. So that's what we're trying to look at for this video. So the first question is why? Why did we need a new constitution? This is some review. Okay. Basically, the Articles of Confederation was not a strong enough government to allow government to act decisively in a time of crisis. So as a form of government, it could not protect life, liberty, and property, which is what, this is what these men had said the role or basic function of government was. Okay, the only evidence they really needed was Shays' Rebellion, right? They knew that, having a rebellion where farmers are agitating to overthrow the government and having the government unable to respond, that was demonstration enough that the government was not functioning. Now, I have a question on here that says why, right? Why was Shays' Rebellion such a concern to our founding fathers? Well, if we think about it, they themselves had just overthrown a government that did not work for them. They understood that, and believed that it was a citizen's duty to overthrow the government if it doesn't work. So seeing Shays' Rebellion, seeing and hearing the rhetoric of the rebellion reflected, the rhetoric of the revolution reflected in Shays' Rebellion, that just made clear that the government under the Articles of Confederation is not okay. It's not a functional government. So we had talked a little bit about how the decision was made, right? So people met at George Washington's home in Mount Vernon. They decided to have a convention in Annapolis. Only 5 of the states showed up, but people were convinced to call for a later convention, right? So we have the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, happened at Pennsylvania. This building here is called Independence Hall. And so this is where they were meeting. There were 55 delegates representing the 13 states. And they came for the purpose of changing the Articles of Confederation. So they were going to revise and make better the Articles of Confederation. But the decision was made very quickly to throw out the Articles of Confederation and to begin anew, to write a new constitution. When they went into this room, they all sat. This is Independence Hall is a museum now, and it is set up like it would have been for the Constitutional Convention. So you can look into this room. You don't get to enter this room if you go visit there. But they went into this room and they took a vow of secrecy. They closed the blinds and windows, and they agreed that nothing that they were discussing in this room would be discussed outside of the room until there was a constitution, like a draft form of government ready to present to the states and the people. So they did this sort of in secrecy, right? The details of what was going on in this room were not shared publicly while it was happening. Okay, what they are trying to do, their purpose or their goal, is to create a government that does not resemble a monarchy, right? They don't want something like King George with absolute power. And King George didn't have absolute power. He's a constitutional monarch. But they believed that they didn't want someone as strong as King George, but they want a government that is powerful enough to tax the citizenry without taking advantage, to regulate trade, so that the economy can be strong, to protect private property, to enforce the laws. Remember, the Articles of Confederation couldn't enforce the laws, they could only make laws. And they wanted to do this without taking away the rights that these people had fought for in the American Revolution. So they wanted a strong government, but not one that tended to tyranny. So how do you do this? I don't think any of them knew completely, but they did it through a series of negotiations and compromise. And that's the next video, is these compromises. Now, we call these men the founding fathers because they were the men that founded our nation. For the attendees of the Constitutional Convention specifically, we reference them as framers, right? The representatives who wrote the Constitution. And when you think of framers, think of like a house frame, right? Somebody who comes in and puts up the frame of a home, and that serves as the structure for everything else. And that's how a lot of people view our Constitution. It is the frame for our government. So if we're looking here, George Washington was elected as the president of the convention. So he is pictured standing here. The oldest in the convention is Benjamin Franklin. He's a kind of father figure. So we see him here. And then the person we call the father of the Constitution is James Madison. And James Madison is a future president, as well as George Washington. James Madison came to the convention with a draft of the Constitution already written. And it is his rough draft that served as the starting off point. So he, out of all of these men, we would say is probably the most influential in the creation of the Constitution. And then for you Hamel nerds right here, this is Alexander Hamilton sitting behind Benjamin Franklin. But this is an idealized photo of how this looked, but they did sit in this room together. The father of the Constitution, James Madison, he is known to say the writing of the Constitution formed a task more difficult than can be well conceived by those who were not concerned in the execution of it. Adding to the difficulty the natural diversity of human opinions on all new and complicated subjects, it is impossible to consider the degree of concord which ultimately prevailed as less than a miracle. Okay, I want you to think about that. At the end, he says, it is impossible to consider the degree of concord which ultimately prevailed as less than a miracle. When we say concord, this is like agreement in terms of compromise, right? So these men compromised. Now, I want you to picture our current government. Let's say representatives from our current government were meeting to compromise and write a constitution. Is it a realistic scenario? I don't know. I do know that in our current political climate, we have a lot of polarization. We have a lack of compromise happening. So what Madison is saying here is that these people came together from different political perspectives and persuasions. They negotiated, they compromised, right? And they came up with a constitution. And he says what came of this is we can't think of it as any less than a miracle. I don't know. From here on out, we don't see this kind of cooperation when we study political history in the United States. So this man, right, James Madison, I mentioned he's known as the father of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. He believes in a strong central government. He is one of the writers of the Federalist Papers, and he will become our fourth president. He'll be the first president, or I should say he will be president during our first declaration of war in the War of 1812. So if we're looking at the occupations of these framers, this graphic here gives us an idea of what kinds of occupations they had. We can see they're varied, but there's some categories here that are pretty well represented: businessmen and lawyers. And so we see also agriculture, right? So farmers and lawyers, because they have a farm and practice the law. a few doctors, but we see a lot of law and business reflected in here. And that's not too different from today when we look at the makeup of our government officials. In terms of slave owners, there are, if we're looking at some of these framers, they were slaveholders, so we have them listed here. There are a few who had large plantations up at the top, right? More than 100, they had more than 100 people enslaved on their properties. And then we have a few that have fewer than 10 slaves. And then names that are not on this list are people who do not own or enslave in this time period. So that's one of the differences between these people. Age, let me moving my face all over the place. If we're looking at age, the oldest delegate is Benjamin Franklin. He was 81 at the time of the Constitutional Convention. And then the last surviving framer is James Madison, father of the Constitution in 1836. So you can see a variety of ages. This bar represents their birth year. So we have them listed here, oldest to youngest. The youngest one was 27. So, but mostly like what we would say middle age, right? In their 40s is the average. Okay, as far as education, it's kind of a mixed bag here. We have about 31 went to college, 24 did not. So you have some like formal education here, and then you have also educated but not formally educated. But every one of these framers were definitely schooled in the Enlightenment and in political thought and theory. None of them were, you would say, uneducated on this topic, even though some of them don't hold like educational certificates. And so if we looked at a snapshot, if we take all of their pictures and put them together into a composite, this is what they look like. Okay, I'm kidding. But if we look at some things that are common, right? They're white male adults. Many are landowners, some education, some are slave owners, lawyers and merchants. These are the framers of the U.S. Constitution. So now their task before them is how to create a national government. Sorry, I didn't realize that I had a little bit of stuff there. So their task is how do they create a national government? So the next video here, we're going to be looking at some of the compromises they made. But if you want to recap what we just looked through, we have 55 delegates. They met in Philadelphia from May of 1787 to September of 1787. Right? We call them the framers because they created the framework for our government. All geographic locations of the United States at that time were represented. That means the 13 states. There's varying levels of formal education, but all were educated, a variety of professions. So these are the framers. So in our next video, we will be looking at, well, I don't know. Oh, yes, we're going to be looking at some of the key issues and the compromises that they will be dealing with. And it's a pretty important video. So I will see you in the next video.